Good morning. Good morning.
I love them. Despite myself sometimes.
Yeah. It is about 20 after 9, so we'll settle in. My name is Gina. For those of you who do not know me, I'm really grateful to be here. This time around, I heard my voice a lot this week. This is the second time I've spoken this week. This morning, I was motivated to do a little bit of looking into what this sentence, Christ is our Passover given to us. Like, I was sitting in church, I was like, Christ is our Passover given to us. What does that mean? You know, like I'm rather curious. What is that? What exactly? What do I mean by that? What do they mean by that? Like, what's going on? And I can't actually say I'm going to conclude with what that means.
Oh.
I have to be careful. I don't know if I've solved the Paschal mystery, but but what I did end up doing was going into Exodus and taking a look at Exodus, taking a look at the tradition of Passover, which is what I'm hoping a little bit our journey this morning, looking at Exodus, looking at Passover, looking at how the first century Jews would have experienced Passover different from how we experience it today, right? And then looking at this imagery, how it's similar to the Jesus imagery, right? Where how much of the Jesus imagery comes out of this Exodus story, the Exodus narrative. So that's where I ended up going. I will see if we can get on this journey together. I hope so. It will start in the book of Exodus, which is what we're reading in the liturgy. Mostly, generally speaking, the way the liturgy is designed, we have our first lesson is from the Old Testament, and our second lesson is from letters, and our third lesson is from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And a lot of that first lesson comes from Exodus during the Lenten season, but not all of it. I think today it's actually Ezekiel, if I looked in the right spot, as an answer. And a lot of the gospel readings come from John, which in John is where Jesus is painted as the Paschal lamb, as the lamb that is sacrificed on Passover, right? So that's how this is being framed for us this season. The book of Exodus is the second book of the Torah. I hope I'm not going back to too many fundamentals for you. I kind of like the fundamentals because I always learn something new. The second book of the Torah, Exodus is, I'm trying to find my notes here. The Torah is, for some people, translated as the law with grace. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy will repeat the story of the Exodus, right? They'll each have their own copy, or their own version of the Ten Commandments in one way or another. Children at Passover memorize a phrase, a passage from Deuteronomy about being a foreigner in a foreign land, right? That's part of the Passover tradition. Exodus is central to the Jewish identity, and that is why it is so important. It's often called the most significant book of the Hebrew Bible. It introduces God's name, Yahweh, an explanation of God, and God responds to and saves the people who are suffering and oppressed in Exodus. And so and it sets up the central relationship, covenantal relationship between the Israelites and God. The major institutions of ancient Israel are all grounded in Exodus and the idea of liberation, prophecy, covenant, community regulations, shrine, festivals, sacrifice, Sabbath, and the tabernacle, right? Those are all coming out of Exodus, and there are four, I don't have a little, the notion of Hesed, which a lot of scholars believe is one of the ideas that Jesus is tightening, is to say compassion comes out of Exodus. Mishpat, which is justice, active justice, and shalom, peace and harmony. These are all introduced in Exodus and then brought into the fundamental Jewish ideas of grace and liberation and identity. And so and a lot of times when we read it, much like the Gospels, much like reading anything in the Bible, you can read it and think, well, now that doesn't sound very mishpat, that doesn't sound very shalom. Like, what's happening there? And in a lot of ways, the Jesus identity for Christians comes out of Exodus, right? That this is the saving, salvific, and the theophany, the actual incarnation of God is also central and in the middle of the story of Exodus. And so there's a pillar of smoke and fire, and there is the tabernacle itself where God dwells. Right? And what ends up happening for us is that Jesus becomes the tabernacle in some ways.
Yeah.
In some ways, and not in all ways. I'm going to start with the story. We're going to run through it. If there's a way to run through Exodus, we're going to do it together.
Good luck with that.
I know, no. It's a great story. I mean, it is, and I love rereading it because all of the central ideas we all have, and I think that Hollywood film has given us a lot of our central ideas. And then there are also things that are genuinely confusing, like the giving of the commandments, the worshiping of the calf, the destruction of the commandments, and then getting the commandments again. There are things that are like, oh wait, that's not as clean in the story as it is like when Hollywood produces that movie, right? It's much more, it's edited, it's a lot easier. At the beginning of Exodus, the Israelites have fled to Egypt because of famine. That is the sons of Jacob. The Israelites multiply to the point that it makes the Pharaoh nervous. The Pharaoh then oppresses the people, and then he starts a killing campaign. Right? He wants the Israelites killed young to manage their population. We meet midwives who save. We meet Moses' mother, who is a trickster. A lot of the women in Exodus are trickster women. They devise ways to survive within the confines of the law, but not in the spirit of the law, right? So the Pharaoh at one point says, throw all the boys into the Nile. And Moses' mother first builds a basket and then puts her son in the Nile. Follows the law, but not the spirit of the law, right? He is then drawn out, named Moses, raised as an Egyptian. Finds out his mother, his adopted mother, who is Pharaoh's daughter, knows the whole time he's Hebrew, which brings up an enormous amount of questions of what she was doing at the Nile pulling babies out. Terrific, but very good of her. Moses kills an Egyptian who is beating a Hebrew person, flees, marries, has kids, and is called then back, right? The voice of God becomes this prominent figure in Exodus. God's will, God's voice, God's commands then begin to take over and are very powerful. They're clear, they're directive, they give power, they give direction, and God's voice gives parameters, right? right? So everything is relational. God says, you gotta head back to Egypt. We're gonna get the people out because I have heard their cries, I have heard their moanings. Moses is like, I'm not so good at the talking. I'm very uncomfortable with this plan. So Aaron is then sent to go along with him. Moses and Aaron are both in the house of Levi. In a lot of ways, this is a priestly tradition of setting up the temple. They then head back and famously threaten the Pharaoh. Right? Our God says, let the people go into the desert and worship. Pharaoh says, no, thank you. I'm going to pass. That's a hard pass. They're my slaves, and I like them right where they are. And 10 plagues, Moses says, then plagues will now be visited. This is very specifically what Passover celebrates, chapters 1 through 14, right? Until Pharaoh is then broken. We will also head into one of the most, I think, difficult and fascinating parts of this story of liberation. As the plagues start, the Nile becomes blood, and then there are frogs, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Then gnats and flies, then a plague on livestock, then boils and hail, and the Pharaoh begs for relief, and then his heart was hardened. This is a fascinating exchange, and the locusts come and destroy the fields. Pharaoh begs again, and his heart is hardened again. Then, very interesting for the Easter season, there's darkness for 3 days, 3 full days of darkness, and then there will be one more plague in Exodus 12, after 3 days of darkness. And after this back and forth of the Pharaoh begging for mercy and having the heart hardened. I was once listening to a rabbi talk on this, and she said, Pharaoh was set up as the god, as the sun god of Egypt, right? And this is a battle between gods. That is what we're reading about, right? These are 2 gods having an absolute clash of wills. And one god is going to prevail. That's the story. And so when we get to this super dark part of Passover, right, where the directions are, you slaughter a pure lamb, you eat the lamb without breaking its bones in the house where it was slaughtered, take the blood, wipe it on your door, the lamb's blood on your door, the Spirit will pass then over your door and only kill the firstborn of the enemy. Right? So the Egyptian firstborn are killed, and the Jewish, the Israelite firstborn are passed over because of the blood of the lamb. They are protected by the blood of the lamb. And this rabbi said, this is the final plague, and this is the God of Israel saying, you go inside and you hide. This is between me and Pharaoh, and we're going to work this out. You are my protected people. Stay safe. Now, historically, before we get too much into literalism, historically this is not a story that has been proven. So if we think of it not as literal, right, then there is we can get a little more expansive, right? As soon as we start to get literal, it's pretty difficult to worship a God that's going to kill the innocent firstborn of your enemies, right? I mean, that's not... You can see where you'd want to align with that God, but you wouldn't necessarily want to worship that God. But that aside, this Exodus is the story of monotheism prevailing. Right? There is but one. And the first commandment will be, once we get out into the desert, you do not put a god before me. Right? This is not our agreement. Right? I will not show this much power and then have you put another god before me. Right? That's our covenantal agreement. So, you get to this problematic thing. That is what Passover means, right? The blood of the lamb protects the people, and they are then passed over from suffering. If we read this part of Exodus, if I can, which I believe we're going to be able to. Exodus, it's either 12:14 or 14:12. This day, it is 12:14, it's the first one I tried. This day shall be a day of remembrance for you. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. Throughout your generations you shall observe it as a perpetual ordinance. 7 days, 8 days outside of Israel, 7 days inside of Israel. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses, for whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day shall be cut off from Israel. I find this really interesting in terms of the Eucharist, right? And the unleavened piece of bread that we get for Eucharist. It's like we celebrate Passover every week in our way, right? Wine and unleavened bread, 4 glasses of wine. It's like an essential part of this ritual of Passover, right? Which I find very, very interesting, the parallels, which is where I started. On the first day you shall hold a solemn assembly, and on the 7th day a solemn assembly. So the first 2 days and the last 2 days of Passover are the high holy days. You can't work, you hold the Sabbath. Let's see, no work shall be done on these days, only what everyone must eat, that alone may be prepared by you. Right? So you only eat what is prepared, only prepare what will be eaten. Which, in the desert, manna from heaven comes. And this happens all throughout Exodus, that it is not just the narrative of the story, it is also the laying down of the ritual and the covenant and the tradition. And so Pharaoh then says, go, right? You are done. We are done. You go into the desert. I cannot anymore fight your God. And there is no time to bake bread. They go into the desert following a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Theophany or Shekinah. I think theophany may be the Latin word. Shekinah is the Hebrew word, right? For this manifestation of God, for this visible God. And in John then we see Jesus always as theophany, right? He is always completely God, holy, and performing miracles as the Exodus God does. And then this theophany and Shekinah in the Hebrew tradition will then become the tabernacle, will dwell in the tabernacle. They hit the Red Sea. There is an event at the Red Sea because once again, Pharaoh's heart has been hardened and he sends his army, right? The Red Sea is parted, the Israelites pass, the Red Sea comes together, the army is defeated. They are now freer than free, right? The story has completely kind of closed up its last loose end, which is this Egyptian army, right? That ostensibly still exists. That no longer exists. They're on the other side of the Red Sea. There is this traveling and there's immediate complaining, which we've been talking about in Christian theology. This is both liberation covenant in terms of our massive meta-narrative, and we've also been talking in sermon and in discussion about it being captivity, right? Which I suppose is really interesting in terms of how you think about your meta-narrative. Do you think about this as a story of captivity and then freedom, or as a story of liberation and then covenant, right? I mean, it's not either or, but that I find the language, the different words people choose to discuss this, I find that fascinating, right? But this is also part of the captivity, and also what we're captive to changes, right? That is a moving target throughout the story. So, so the complaining starts, which is kind of natural because they are hungry and thirsty, which happens rather quickly, right? Humans, we really do need sustenance, not only daily, but several times a day. And the Lord provides manna from heaven, right? That disappears at the end of the day, kind of this magical feast. And water with the staff. Moses is sent out to a specific place to find water. And then we begin to, at this part of the story, get the sacrificial elements of the Hebrew tradition. Jethro offers to sacrifice to God and starts suggesting leadership positions, right? You need to elect judges. Judges come before kings in the Hebrew narrative, in the Bible, right? If you read the chapter of Judges, if anything bad happens, there was an army and it came, and this is what happens when you have judges and not kings, right? I suspect Judges was written by the kings, right? That there is, in Exodus, we get the idea that judges are going to be elected. In Judges, we hear about the judges and what their names are, but the passages kind of end with this thing like, this was a very chaotic time because there weren't any kings, and then eventually the Israeli story is going to move on to kings through Solomon and David. In that line, there is, it is because Exodus significantly is a story of going from the tribes of Jacob to the nation of Israel. Right? This is a story of development of the people beyond a tribal identity. And what does that mean? Now they hit Sinai. God is going to talk to Moses. What the Lord has spoken, we will do. In Exodus 24, 20 through 24, we're going to get commandments. Moses' face is going to change. There will be 40 days on the mountain, not an insignificant number in terms of Lent, and not an insignificant number in terms of the imagery of Jesus. When Jesus goes out to the desert for 40 days, that is a reflection of Moses going to the mountain for 40 days, right? That Jesus, there is, particularly in Matthew, pains to create a story where Jesus is Moses. Say, the Sermon on the Mount, these stories of Sinai is then also reflected in the Sermon on the Mount, right? Jesus stands on a mountain and gives lessons, right? Which is exactly what Moses is doing here. Standing on a mountain after being at the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. Rules that comes back with the rules for the tabernacle. We're gonna hit another problematic part here of Exodus because they're gonna worship a golden calf, and then 3,000 of them are gonna get killed, which was kind of a bargain. It was very difficult to negotiate. And then a second law, the commandments are written down a second time. The 10 commandments are written down a second time. And then the tabernacle is built. And then Exodus ends. And that's the end of Exodus. They don't ever make it to the promised land. Just also, in terms of our paschal mystery, fascinating that we await the rising, like at the end of Exodus, they await know.
Yeah. Yeah, I just I have a question about how abstract it is, you know. Because you could look at it, like you were saying earlier, literally. I mean, literally, people want to escape from slavery. Literally, a boat parts water, rafts part water to the other side. Manna, you can chop up cactus and eat the insides of cactus.
Or locust is another, right?
Yeah.
Locust or some kind
And you
of
could say
physical-
that's definitely from heaven. And you could easily find a spring and hit it with a stick and say, look, water. But, you know, I mean, not to diminish. I'm just wondering, and then 40 days up on a mountain, I could carve in a tablet a bunch of words and say, you know, God inspired me. You know, I mean, there's nothing wrong with it. So my question is, why do we need this gigantic, miraculous abstraction to explain it all? I mean, there's a function there.
Yeah, there is a function there. Does anyone want to respond to that? I mean, I have ideas I can spout, but yes.
I think it relates to at least my experience reading the Old Testament has been that it's almost a setup for Jesus coming. So there's all of these stories that Jesus kind of in his own way duplicates. And then we kind of go back to the Old Testament, then he kind of turned it on its head, turned it around. And then we go back and now we can see like all these connecting of the dots essentially. So it's, I don't want to say it quite like this, but it's almost like we needed the Exodus story for Jesus to come and do what he needed to come and do. And it's our, we know that God said that, but that's our visual imprint of it, I guess.
Gina, the fact that it survived for so long and it's meant so much to so many different groups of people is evidence of the power of it, to my mind.
Yeah. Oh, those are really great comments. Yeah, it's where it serves. I guess one of the things is that out of deep respect for the Jewish faith, I think it's important to, you know, right? But also for me, I think it's because of the problematic pieces, right? It is because of all the death that I kind of have to go abstract, right? That if I take it literally, right, then it's a little like, well, this is a really disturbing story, literally, right? Mm-hmm. That we're going to sacrifice the many or the, you know, the Egyptian population for this oppressed population, right? But on the other hand, maybe that's fair term, right? I mean, in that sense where it's like, well, yeah, that is what happens, right? What happens when there's an uprising is people die.
I'm in a real horrible state of human beings, right? To this day. I mean, you know, things get horrible.
Right, it is, and what's interesting about that, the reality of our lives, right, and the reality of the earth and where we are right now is exactly that, where it's like, to what extent can we rely on the literalism of God saving us when people clearly aren't being saved? Right? That it then becomes too heartbreaking of a reality. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's like, oh no, that's too heartbreaking to say we believe in this liberation God who literally frees people unless you live in Aleppo or Somalia or, you know, Afghanistan. Or, you know what I'm saying?
It starts to erode your faith if you get so...
Yeah. But it's, no, I hear you, but if you go too abstract, then you're too distant from it.
And you lose people along the way that say, wow, that's a little hard to believe.
Yes?
So back at the time of Exodus, did you have to be born Jewish or could you be Jewish? Was it a culture or was it, what was it at that time? So in other words, getting to what he's getting at is, oh, just because of your genes or your culture, God is going to save you?
was traditionally, at the time, you did belong to one of the 12 tribes, right? And what we begin to see here in Exodus is the breaking up of the tribal jobs, right? That the house of Aaron is the priestly tribe. Some of the some of Levi, of the high priests are in the actual tabernacle, but by the time of Jesus, by the 1st century, there was an estimate that there were 10,000 people who identified with being in the priestly tribe. So like in the story of the Good Samaritan, when a priest walks by the Good Samaritan, that's not necessarily a high priest. That could just be a member of the tribe of Levi, right? A member of the house of Aaron, right? That was not necessarily someone in the, in a high temple priest. So you could have a really great priestly job or just be a member of the priestly tribe. Yes?
For how many centuries or years have scholars or theologians, if you will, drawn these parallels between Christianity and Exodus, some of which you mentioned, the 40 days? In other words, when did all of this begin?
I think right out of the gate. This is, these trails of discovery are so interesting to me, and this actually isn't even my field. I'm not an expert, but I did end up pursuing this sentence, right? That's where I started. Jesus is our Passover given to us, and I was like, what on earth does that mean? And if you put a passage into Google, if it's a biblical passage, the first thing that will come up are your Bible sources, right? And as it turns out, that's a sentence from Paul, from Romans. Mm-hmm. Paul says it in Romans. So right out of the gate, they were looking for these identifying features, Jesus as Messiah, Jesus as prophet, right? Like what category are you going to put this figure in, And the way the synagogues in the diaspora were set up was they were kind of a reflection of the temple. And so there was always a court of Gentiles in the synagogues, where which I love this idea. I think we should resurrect this idea. In 1st century Rome, you could be like a spiritual tourist. You would go and check out what other people were doing in their temples. And so the court of the Gentiles were people who were checking out what the Jews were doing but weren't Jewish. So they listened to the teachings, but they couldn't go into a certain area of the temple, right? You were on the outer part, and those were the people Paul was converting. Those were the Gentiles. A lot of people, a lot of Pauline scholars, believe that that's where Paul was doing his mission work, that he was hitting those spiritual tourists who knew a lot about the Jewish faith but weren't Jewish themselves, right? That he was, and in that way, he would take the teachings and apply them to Jesus, and create this Christ following, right? And say, this God that is the one, which was one of the unique features of the Hebrew faith, is, one, which is so central to Exodus. We're going to have a battle of the gods, and ours is going to be the one. And in Genesis, we get a little hint of this too, where God is talking to people, or talking to entities, right? Let's be careful that they not become one of us, uses the pronoun us. And so one of these thoughts on monotheism is not that we don't acknowledge there are other gods, it's that we do not put any of those other gods before ours, right? So, and in modern terms, again, this kind of extrapolating out, it's not that money or fear or love isn't a God in my life, right? It is just not the one God, right? That it ought not become number one. That's what we're trying to do in our faith. It isn't like we're going to pretend like we don't worship our screens, right? But we do not consciously make our screens our one God, hopefully. My daughter currently is at home because she didn't want to come here, and I guarantee her screen is her one God at this very moment, right? What's happening on YouTube? But so right out of the gate, right, Paul was framing as was Matthew, Christ as an extension, as a natural next the awaited Messiah from the Hebrew scriptures. And that's why there's Isaiah, there's these, the prophets and the imagery from Exodus is so important.
What does a diaspora mean?
It is the sending out, right? It is, it means...
Evangelical, like?
No, like a breaking up.
Oh.
Right? So they were all together, and then they were broken apart.
By whatever.
By forces. Yeah, there's one, the Babylonians created diaspora, right? Famine in the time of Jacob creates one. There's all kinds of different midrashes about who goes where, right? One of them is that Dan went to England, right? That the root word for the word England actually is Hebrew and comes from Dan, right? One of the sons of Jacob. And so there's a lot of, midrash stories about the world then being populated out by the breaking up of the tribes.
Not to change the subject.
No, go ahead.
My genealogy came back and said you're from a diaspora, Jewish diaspora area. Well, I don't know what that means.
Could be anything.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of them because they're a persecuted people, right? And so when, let's see, the biggies are Jacob, famine, out they go, diaspora. And the reason that that in the time of the Babylonians, the Hebrews focused on Exodus was that saving period, right? Babylonians come, same thing, break up the leadership, send the scribes, send the teachers one place, send the politicians another place, send the priests a third place, but break up the power center, right? Which for a lot of time was the temple, Islam, it's Muhammad. There are a number of them. Russia. I think that the Russian Jews refer to a diaspora, right? That they are then sent out. I know it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then the last piece I want to talk about is how, because I find this fascinating, how this first century historical Jesus would have experienced Passover, because there was a march to Jerusalem, to the temple, to actually sacrifice, right? Where there was an actual sacrificial ceremony, right? Which we don't, anachronistically, we don't experience anymore. So it's very hard. This is one of the hardest things for me to wrap my brain around, is that, Jesus as a child would have gone down to Jerusalem with his family. There would have been up to 100,000 pilgrims, they say. So says Paul Frederickson. The Romans would have been incredibly nervous about this celebration, right? The occupying Romans did not like one little bit a yearly mass influx of Jews to celebrate their freedom from slavery. Like, if you can imagine being a Roman ruling king, you can pretty much play out why that is a very uncomfortable experience for the Romans, right? So Roman occupying armies are coming in at the same time, right? They are surrounding the temple. So there are armies around the temple, and there is this whole influx. Brueggemann would be I was listening to a couple of his sermons getting ready for this. He's very much into, for the last couple of years, the idea that this outside economy would then be bringing these goods and services into this urban economy, into this urban elite economy, right? So there would be an enormous amount of tension there, right? The poverty of the outskirts would then be exposed to the opulence of the city, right? And all of this tension is happening, and you're bringing your lamb to actually physically sacrifice on the altar, right? As directions given in Exodus, not just Exodus because they're expanded, and in Deuteronomy, Numbers, and Leviticus, and it's a 7-day celebration, right? It's supposedly a celebration, high tension celebration, right? It is, and yearly, a couple of people would be killed to keep everybody else in line, right? This was a regular way of keeping the population in control while they're celebrating their freedom. So, and that's how the young Jesus would have experienced Passover. There would have been this journey that I'm sure was quite fun, actually, right? I mean, it was a celebration, right? And you wouldn't take the journey there'd be a number of reasons why you wouldn't go. If somebody close in the family could handle the dead body, you know, within a certain amount of time beforehand, you wouldn't go. And there's this phrase, clean, unclean, which again, I think it's a little manipulated in our thinking, you know, which you aren't considered unclean in a like caste system India way for sacrifice, right? You're just not ready, right? It's a state of non-readiness.
It's a state of you have something else you need to take care of.
A lot of times you're taking care of something else. You're mourning, right? Or you've just recently given birth, or, you know, there would be in that sense. And what ends up happening in the Synoptic Gospels, which we all know, is there's this Passover dinner that Jesus has before, and the words are the same. The Paschal lamb, Jesus becoming the Paschal lamb, is the Hebrew word that comes directly from the Hebrew word for Passover. Jesus celebrates this Passover meal, Passover Seder, right, which would have had all of these rules around it before being sacrificed. And then in John, which we'll take a look at in Holy Week, in John, Jesus actually is the Passover lamb. So there is no Passover dinner in John. Rather, Jesus is the sacrificed lamb on Passover, right? They do not share in the blood of the lamb. Jesus then becomes the lamb, which is really complicated. Yeah. I mean, it kind of makes your mind do flips in a way. And again, certainly, you're a new person. There was someone sitting there before you. In this idea of like, you know, Jesus as liberator, right? That is absolutely the imagery that's being used. Absolutely liberating us from sin and death, right? Redemptive. This is. It also draws a question of how literal that is. Right? Let's see. I also want to talk about Passover as a remembrance quickly. That it is done yearly to remember a a very specific thing, which in the Anglican tradition, if you read the middle of the prayer book, right, like what does the Eucharist mean? You know, for the Catholics, there's a transfiguration, you know, there's a thing that happens right at the altar. And some Anglicans believe that happens as well, that there is like a miracle, mirroring, and something happens to the bread and wine. And that goes all the way on the spectrum. It is also acceptable in the Anglican faith to treat the Eucharist like a remembrance, right? That to do this in remembrance of me, to kind of literalize that statement more than literalizing the blood and the body of the Lamb. And I am forever now fascinated every time we go through this in the liturgy. I'm now listening really intently, like what are we remembering, right? And if it is a weekly Passover, then what does that mean to me? And you know, and in the progression of the Gospels, what does it mean that there's this progression from Jesus celebrating the Passover to Jesus becoming the Passover? And all of which would be acceptable in the Anglican tradition, right? That is where we are. A couple of weeks ago in the talk, there was this phrase, we are more Hebraic in tradition, right, than some other Christian traditions, and that means we're more in discussion. That there's more question and answer. Part of the Passover feast and the celebration is that kids ask 4 questions, right? Children are expected to prepare 4 questions and have 4 questions, right? That there is this like exchange of ideas, right? Like what's going on? And so that is, I mean, I don't have answers. That's a really long way of saying I didn't think I was actually going to have an answer, but I honestly don't from my starting point. And the last thing I want to say, I'm staring at my notes really quickly about this imagery between Jesus and Moses, is that they are both portrayed as enemies to power and order. Right? That Jesus and Moses are both kind of shown to be an enemy to power and an enemy to order. Where there's order, but it's slavery, there's disorder and it's liberation, and then there's order and it's covenant. Right? And then we're in the confines of the relationship as opposed to the confines of slavery.
There's so much power in churches.
So, order, disorder, order.
Those of us who go against the power.
That is. Are there? And now somebody needs to make an announcement. Who's making an announcement? Is that you? You are making an announcement. We have an announcement. Are there any comments before we go? I'm not sure that I've said anything this morning at all.
You have.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that one of the questions that the kids ask on Passover, which I remember from being a Christian kid in a Jewish Catholic neighborhood, one of the questions they ask is, why is this night so
Why is this night different
from
than
any other night? And then there are 3 other questions, and I never heard any of them.
I don't remember them.
And the Passover and Easter are linked on the lunar calendar, right? There's also this fact, right, that the spring equinox, the Passover starts on the full moon following the spring equinox, and Easter is the first Sunday after the full moon of the spring equinox.
Yeah.
My astrology friend is like, that is so pagan of you. You know. No, it's Jewish calendar, it's lunar calendar of us is what it is. And follows then until Pentecost, right? There is another, at Pentecost, 50 days later, the Jewish celebration of the harvest and our celebration of Pentecost happen simultaneous as well. We will follow each other in these movable feasts throughout the season.
I won't assume the podium because I'm